We are Team 13, and we are going to be participating in this debate from the against side of the topic, net-centric warfare should be at the center of a developed country's military strategy. Net-centric warfare is a military doctrine or theory pioneered by the United States Department of Defense in the 1990s. Its goal is to obtain an information advantage in warfare and is enabled by recent advancements in information technology. Our team understands that with the way that information technology is now permeating almost every aspect of society, that modern warfare is a logical step in IT evolution. However, we do not believe that net-centric warfare, or NCW, should be at the center of a developed country's military strategy. Instead, NCW should be developed in parallel to traditional warfare methods. There are many arguments that our team will put forward. These arguments revolve around overdependence on IT, cyber espionage and access to civilian data, droids in the battlefield and what governs their applications, the negative impact on human life caused by drones, and the impact that NCW can have on war and soldiers. Overdependence or heavy reliance on technology, particularly infrastructure, is one of the major issues identified with net-centric warfare. This reliance on infrastructure is often coupled with a significant risk. Networks and IT interfaces can become the primary target for opponents to exploit. When any computer that connects to the internet can be attacked, it is hazardous if alternative ways of working are not available. This overdependence on a central network has been exploited in the past by cyber attacks. An example of this is the 77 million accounts that were compromised in the 2011 Sony PlayStation Network outage. This outage affected the whole world and lasted 23 days. If this type of outage occurred in a military environment, the negative circumstances could leave a country's military personnel without the ability to effectively carry out their duties, which could lead to a massive loss of life. Also, an overdependence or centralized focus on net-centric warfare can leave a country open to more traditional attacks, if they do not evolve in those areas as well. Examples of these dangers include third and fourth generation warfare. Third generation warfare is the war of maneuvering or outmaneuvering your opponents, while fourth generation warfare relates to fighting non-state opposition. Both these types are evident in the world to different extents. These dangers may be ignored or not adequately protected against in a net-centric warfare military strategy.
Internet is meant to be a universal communication medium, and in this generation it has become a primary tool of emancipation. When cyber attacks are being promoted and have become a norm, many ethical issues may arise for businesses or the common civilians and their private data. Anyone with a knowledge of how to attack the cyber network poses a threat, not only from the opposition, but from even our own government. Cyber attacks includes exploitation of stealing personal information and disruption or destruction of networks. When our own government or authoritative figures have the ability to gain access to any data on the internet, what is to stop them from monitoring the civilian lives in the name of their so-called justice? Any computer that is online is vulnerable, from government's deepest secrets to a company's hard-earned profit. However, this is especially severe to civilians who have little to no means of protecting themselves. In their cyber domain, all the advantages go to the attacker, and defense is very difficult and requires a great deal of knowledge and energy, which the average person might not have in order to protect themselves properly.
Drones outside of the battlefield has caused a tremendous amount of headaches and suffering for civilians. For example, in Phelan, California, 5 unmanned drones prevented firefighters from dispatching helicopters with water buckets for up to 20 minutes over a wildfire. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the extra 20 minutes meant that the potential for serious damage can significantly increase. Another example is that drones can have dire consequences if they come into contact with a plane, especially if they get caught on the plane's engine. With the price of drones steadily decreasing, the amount of owners are also rising. For example, in the US alone, there are already 300,000 owners reported. These increase of drones are causing privacy problems. The White House also suffered from a civilian-piloted drone when it crashed into the White House, causing an immediate lockdown. Outside of the White House, there has been several reports of drones causing privacy issues. For example, a law in Wisconsin was recently passed that prohibits the taking of nude or partially nude person using a drone.
Now that we've examined the damaging effects of drones in the battlefield, the question becomes, how easy is it for terrorists to build their own robots? That question is not at all far-fetched, since we have seen an increase in hacking activity where 73% of Americans have fallen victims to cybercrime, and in 2008, $1 trillion of intellectual property had been stolen. So then, what stops terrorists from hacking into existing weapon systems, 3D printing weapons, purchasing weapons cheaply, or simply fabricating their own? Unfortunately, while it is difficult to imagine why anyone would sell such robots without considering the ethical implications, it is important to realize that these drones/bots are highly commercialized, and it is possible to purchase a Raven drone that soldiers use in Iraq for $1,000. Now, Peter Singer, who is director of the 21st Century Defense Initiative and a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., has predicted that robots and terrorism will empower individuals, making it easier to launch terror attacks. While robot terror attacks have become more of a concern since they are more readily available, this doesn't touch the core at which the concern lies. An Air Force study suggests that drones are the ideal platforms used for launching weapons of mass destruction, and as it stands, there is no effective counter mechanism. Singer, in one of his books, has also outlined that a Pentagon scientist claims that he could shut down all of Manhattan with a budget of $50,000. This shows the devastating effects to which technology can be used. Now, apart from terrorists, any sorts of groups can now participate in warfare. A private military contractor offered to rent an unmanned vehicle to a group of college students to use in intervening in the genocide in Darfur in Sudan. There are no limitations to those who can participate in warfare. Next, I would like to show you a video of Michio Kaku, a theoretical physicist talking about the dark side of technology.
It turns out that the electron shells of U-235 and U-238 are almost identical, but not exactly identical. By the laws of quantum mechanics, the energy levels of U-235 are slightly misaligned to the energy levels of U-238. You can create a laser beam with exactly the energy of the difference between these two, so that you can activate one but not the other. In other words, laser beams can be used to zap these atoms and separate out U-235 from U-238. Well, this means that in some sense, somebody in their basement at some point in the future might be able to build a separation device to create U-235. That's a nightmare that we don't have yet, but it's a nightmare that we will have in the coming years as the price of laser enrichment of uranium starts to go down.
In addition, as there are dozens of countries have indicated interest in weaponized drone, they're concerned that the growth in the use of drone may make policymakers more prone to use forces. It isn't that drones are intrinsically unlawful or overly destructive. The bigger problem is, it is that drones create incentives for policy choices that could have devastating consequences. But why, and what's the incentive? It is simply because drones do not put pilots at risk for a mission. According to the author of the report, released by the Simpson Center in 2014, stated this. In other words, he is saying if you have got what seems like a cost-free way to take out a potential threat to the United States, why would you ever stop using it? One of the biggest problems, according to the report, if the US endorses using drone strike without the consent of foreign governments, the country risks creating a kind of moral, legal domino effect that could spur other countries to use drones in legally reasonable ways. It means that the more the US uses them to strike purported terrorists around the world, the more of a risk there is that other countries start mimicking this policy. It is essentially escalating to wider wars.
Recent figures show that the US now has 5,300 unmanned aerial vehicles and over 12,000 ground robots. These devices reduce the risk to human soldiers, but concerns have been expressed that the growth in the use of these technologies are making policymakers view war as a more attractive option. Israel and Korea are already using drones to patrol their borders. Drones are used to find and defuse bombs and now carry weapon systems. Drone pilots have now been shown to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, even though they may be thousands of miles from the battlefield. It is now thought that this may be due to it being harder for the soldier to justify killing if they're not under threat themselves. Some argue that drone pilots can end up with a PlayStation mentality and become disassociated with the casualties. Besides, can programmers imagine every situation that robots will encounter on the battlefield? Robots might be hacked by the enemy and could be turned against the friendly troops as well.
In closing, our team has touched upon and explained several reasons why we have chosen a stance against this week's topic of net-centric warfare should be at the center of a developed country's military strategy. We have focused on the overdependence on IT, cyber espionage, droids and drones and their applications and impacts, as well as the impact that net-centric warfare can have on war and soldiers. For all these reasons, we believe that net-centric warfare should not be at the center of a developed country's military strategy.